PTSD has kind of, it seems to me, post-traumatic stress disorder has seemed to brought trauma to the forefront of something that people are thinking about it. We hear about our soldiers coming back and so forth with this trauma and the various treatments for this trauma. But it turns out that trauma is much, much, much larger issue for our society than just these soldiers coming back with PTSD.
Yeah, it's all a very political issue, but I was part of the creation of that diagnosis, and interestingly, before we had this diagnosis, nobody talked about child abuse, nobody talked about domestic violence, nobody talked about the hell that people put each other through. It's really astonishing how that was completely off the map. And so when we first defined PTSD, we called it an extraordinary event outside of the realm of ordinary human experience. And then it turned out that about more than 70% of people have traumatic experiences in their lives. So somehow we had been living in la-la land all that time. And because we are the most warlike country since Genghis Khan, we have a large number of soldiers who we send all around the globe to bring our wonderful system around the globe. And because of that, a lot of soldiers come back, but and that's where the money goes. But in fact, for every soldier that gets hurt in the war, there's at least 30 kids who get hurt at home. So trauma is much more common at home than abroad. And for women, the greatest source of trauma is their intimate partners. And for kids, the greatest source of trauma is their own parents, oftentimes their mothers.
Yeah, I was thinking about the fact that if a rugged soldier, who signs up for war can suffer from trauma, then I imagine that a child, a 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old child must be much more susceptible to trauma than the rugged soldier.
Well, there's a nice image of the rugged soldier. Of course, people who join the military are generally not the most promising members of society. They oftentimes escape violence, employment difficulties, poverty in their own backgrounds. And in fact, people who enlist in the army have a much higher rate of early childhood trauma than the general population. So I love your depiction of rugged soldiers, but that's not quite how it works either.
Yeah, that's a good correction. And actually, let me ask it in a different way. The difference.
Well, that can certainly answer your question also.
Oh, sorry.
And that is, see, the issue, the fact that we have a PTSD diagnosis is sort of a gross oversimplification. It's about an event. But we have really become much more sophisticated about it in that we know that for children, having a predictable, loving, reflective, and non-scary environment is critical. And so probably the greatest source of pathology in our society, probably at the end more expensive than cancer or heart disease, is children getting exposed to abuse and neglect and to domestic violence, which has far-ranging and pervasive effects on their brains, their minds, their endocrine systems, their stress hormone systems, etc., etc. And the Centers for Disease Control calculate that it's more expensive than these leading causes of death, and that in fact it has very pervasive effects on people's medical states, on their mental states, on their physical states, their employment capacities, their learning capacities, etc., etc.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I was going to restate the question to just talk about the developed adult brain versus the developing child brain.
Right.
It doesn't take a rocket scientist to guess, I'll guess, and hopefully you confirm right, that a child's brain is much more susceptible to being damaged by trauma, and the amount of quote-unquote trauma does not need to be near as much. Oh, you're getting a call? Oh, there you go.
No, okay. No, it's my son calling me. Okay. Well, see, a child's brain is not formed. So a child's brain forms in the context of the system that it lives in. And if a child is being terrified by its own caregivers, that child develops a brain that is geared towards dealing with terror and fear and trying to do as well as it can. And so the child develops a brain that becomes very alert for danger, that is ready to fight, that's ready to see problems everywhere. It's not a brain that likes to play and to just basically explore the world. So if you live in dangerous surroundings, you develop by and large a brain that has a hard time focusing, concentrating, and that oftentimes gets misdiagnosed as attention deficit disorder or conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, meaning that these kids have developed a mind and a brain that is pretty good in surviving extreme danger and abandonment, but is not very good in becoming a member of a civilized society.
So compare what it does to the brain, for instance, to be left alone for 10 days and not knowing where you are. You're a 2-year-old, you're a 6-year-old, you're a 12-year-old, you're a 22-year-old, you're a 32-year-old. I would imagine that the impact of that varies dramatically based on age.
That's true to a large degree, but being left alone is very hard for people of any ages. So that we have brains that are wired for connections. We have brains that are wired for getting along with each other, talking to each other, preparing meals together, making Zoom calls with people. We are a connected species. And so for people to be disconnected, since time immemorial, people have known that if you really want to punish somebody, you put them in solitary confinement. And I think that people don't talk nearly enough about the extreme cruelty of solitary confinement that is widely practiced in our jails. Of course, if you leave a child all by itself, that child is a developing brain, and that child doesn't develop the neuronal systems that you need in order to get along with other people. And so the brain is a use-dependent organ. The brain gets formed according to the experiences that you have. The brain is a cultural organ. It gets shaped by whatever is going on around you, particularly during the first 6 to 8 years of life. And that's the brain you get. You get a brain that is really prepared to deal with danger, to shut down, and to disconnect, basically.
We talk so much about treatment of these things once the person is an adult and now they're suffering as a result of their childhood trauma or neglect. But it's just as important, it seems to me, to be talking to parents and for parents to be understanding this, parents of young children to understand that developing brain and how easily it's impacted and how easily it could be subjected to something that is essentially traumatic for a young child that's going to ultimately have long-term effects.
Yeah, parents, it's very, to a large degree, a political issue, of course, in what sort of social systems you have in place, what sort of systems you have in place that help parents to raise their children. In every civilized country in the world, except for the US, parents get between half a year and a year of paid leave to take care of their kids. That pays off enormously, of course. In the Netherlands, where I grew up, the incarceration rate currently is 68 per 100,000 people. In the US, it's over 900 per 100,000 people. So that's a factor of a gigantic factor. So if you don't have systems in place that help parents who often themselves have been traumatized to securely raise their children, the likelihood that this will go on from generation to generation is very great. And these are larger political issues that are not unknown about people. For example, in the year 2000, a guy by the name of John Heckman won the Nobel Prize for showing that for every dollar that a society invests in helping young mothers raise their children, in the long range, a society harvests $7 in benefits. And so if you don't have these early caregiving systems, you end up like we do with 2.3 million people in jail and over 500,000 kids in foster care. Well, in countries where people invest in kids from very early on, of course, they function much better.
What about the old-fashioned form of caregiving, which is that the mother is home with the child full-time and the father is out making the money to bring home to raise the family with?
Well, I'm not sure if that model uniformly ended up with better adjusted people.
So it's is
nice
there a comparison?
To be romantic about, but
yeah.
You know, if your mom is drunk at home, or your mom is an out of control, angry person, staying home with mom may not be the great thing either, as maybe some kids are experiencing these days, being locked up with the coronavirus.
Well, have there been studies about a mother at home raising the child versus mom and dad go work and they drop the kid off at daycare?
Not as far as I know. There's some studies on daycare. Some people really thought that daycare would be very disastrous. It has not turned out to be that way. And certainly in cultures where you have clear sexual divisions like India and Pakistan and other places around the world, the incidence of abuse and domestic violence is not lower than in this country.
So if you were writing a guide to parents right now, based, you know, I know there's all kinds of political issues and societal issues, this and that, but you're telling your son and your daughter-in-law, based on all the research I've done and the studying I've done over my career, 30 plus years, whatever it's been, you're extremely accomplished in your field of trauma. What would you be advising them regarding raising their child?
Number one is family meals. That's a very simple thing, has been shown to be an extraordinarily good predictor of long-term family functioning. Just having meals together for breakfast and dinner, cooking together, sitting down together, and debriefing each other is a very powerful factor. You need to be parents. That means you need to be at home, need to work with your kids, need to read to your kids, need to take your kids to school, show up for school plays, play sports with them, go camping, go on vacation with them, stuff like that.